So welcome, everyone, and welcome back to those who have been to these terrific sessions these last weeks, and to those who took part in any of our 2021 webinars. Great to have you with us today. And this is our final session, which I'm sad about, this wonderful series for season 2. And the theme today is on relocation and climate change, which I'm very much looking forward to, and I'm sure you are too. And before I introduce our wonderful guests, I'll introduce myself. My name is Pete Smith, and I am your host. I'm also the Executive and Creative Director for the Canadian Centre for Rural Creativity, and it remains a distinct honor and a privilege to be here. Today, I am speaking to you from the city of Toronto, and I want to acknowledge that I am on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and further acknowledge that Toronto is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We invite you to share the lands that you live, work, and play on, and are participating from today in the chat section if you like. We also want to thank the Recovery Cohort and others who are supporting the creation of this series. They include the BC Association of Emergency Managers and BC Hydro. And as with each of these sessions, a special shout out is in order to the wonderful Deb Borzos, the #1 producer of this important web series. Thanks so much, Deb. Any resources or information or comments you have to share can be added to the chat section throughout today's session. There will be a list made and shared of links as well as presenters' contact information at the end of the series. Now, if you want to contact a presenter or find information shared from a particular session before then, please be in touch via the following link. Alexa will be putting it in the chat. It's at communitydisasterrecovery@gmail.com. And Alexa is our IT producer, and I want to thank her for all the great work that she does and has been doing for all of these webinars. And it's great to be working alongside her. And along with the links for the British Columbia Association for Emergency Managers that you'll see is a link to the Canadian Centre for Rural Creativity if you're curious about that. The sessions are being recorded and will be kept on the BC Association of Emergency website. It usually takes about a week or so to get them loaded to the site, so please be patient. We appreciate it. Now, during the presentations, please leave your video and audio turned off, as for some attending, it can offer challenges with instability of connection. Now, we have an hour or so, so I will get right to it. I'll introduce each guest and we'll turn things over to them one at a time. They each have approximately 15 to 20 minutes to speak, and we'll save the Q&A for after the second presentation. I'll keep an eye on the chat for your questions and reflections as the presenters give us their insights, and we'll get to as many of those as we're able following the presentations. Our two presenters today are Dr. Lily Umagolova and Dr. Alessandra Girolman, who will provide us with a fabulous opportunity to listen in and participate in a discussion from an American and Canadian perspective on the theme of relocation and climate change. Alessandra is our first speaker, and in way of introduction, she is a PhD, MPA, consultant in disaster resilience and hazard mitigation, and she hails from the great state of Louisiana in the USA. She is an associate professor and director of the doctoral program in emergency management at Jacksonville State University's Emergency Management Department. She is a community resilience specialist and applied researcher at the Lowlander Center, as well as co-founder of Hazard Resilience, a United States-based consultancy providing leadership and expertise in disaster recovery, risk reduction, and hazard policy. In 2019, she published a book titled Disaster Recovery Through the Lens of Justice, and recently released a follow-up edited volume, Justice, Equity, and Emergency Management. Dr. Girolman is one of the founders of the Natural Hazard Mitigation Association, NHMA, and she served as its executive director for its first 7 years. Dr. Girolman is a subject matter expert in climate adaptation, hazard mitigation, disaster recovery, and resilience, with a long history of working in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. She is involved in various aspects of planning and policy at the national and local level, including participation in several workshops each year. Her experience includes conducting independent research on disaster risk reduction and hazard mitigation for various organizations, such as the National Wildlife Foundation. She works as the lead grant writer and emergency planner for the First Peoples Conservation Council through her role with the Lowlander Center on Coastal Community Resettlement, work that includes community-based resilience, planning across the United States, and working with Save the Children USA along the Gulf Coast following hurricanes and tornadoes on a resilience initiative around children's needs in emergencies. She also works in hazard mitigation, planning at the local, state, and campus level, and in the world of community education and outreach regarding mitigation measures and preparedness, development of collaborative networks and information sharing avenues among practitioners, and delivery of training and education to various stakeholders. It's a great pleasure to have you here, Alessandra. It really is. And just going through your bio, there's so much that you have to offer us. So welcome, and I'll now turn things over to you.
Thank you so much. Let me go ahead and share my screen so that you can see my PowerPoint. Hello, everybody, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I hope to learn a lot from everybody that's here as well. I'm speaking today from New Orleans, which traditionally has been territory for many Native nations, in particular the Attakapas, Chitimacha, and Choctaw. And much of my work is actually further south from the city of New Orleans in more rural communities that we affectionately refer to as being down the bayou. Areas that tend to be forgotten when a storm such as Hurricane Ida comes in and makes landfall, and a lot of the media attention, a lot of the national attention focuses on what's going to happen in the city of New Orleans as the population center, as opposed to the rural communities that, again, are heavily populated by Indigenous persons. In thinking about this question of climate migration, relocation, climate adaptation, I think it's always really important to ask who it is that is being asked to bear the burden. And I like to really start from that question, because although we tend to hear a lot in the United States about the need for people to migrate and move, we tend to hear that with respect to particular communities. We tend to hear that in, for example, small riverine communities that are lower income and primarily African American. We don't hear it as much when you look at larger, higher value homes in Miami, which is also going underwater, is also flooding frequently, even just from high tides. Similarly, we have communities such as Ile de Jean Charles here in coastal Louisiana, and the village of Shishmaref in Alaska, that have been talking about the need to resettle, to move for a while. But the narratives seem to focus on how the communities are going to adapt, what they're going to do in terms of the risk. And the narrative doesn't focus on where the risk came from, right? Doesn't focus on the fact that in many ways, the need to now move is a natural outgrowth of colonialism. So that's sort of my framing. That's where I start from when I think about this question and when I talk about this. In a lot of the kind of technical environments, the professional environments, even such as this one, excuse me, a lot of people are focusing, excuse me, a lot of people are focusing much more on the need to move, right? There's concern that there are frequent storms, there are frequent events. And this graphic is from a report that came out just at the start of this year, showing the number of billion-dollar climate disasters that we've had on US soil in the year 2021. 2021 did not break records, but 2020 did by about, I believe, $5 or $6 billion disasters. So this is frequent, this is consistently occurring, and this is driving a conversation around whether or not we need to move out of harm's way. And part of that conversation is very important and relevant and needs to be happening, because we certainly can't expect to adapt without having some shifts of population, right? There's no such thing as a natural disaster. A disaster is that intersection of the natural hazard with the human, social, political, and built environment. Along the coast here in Louisiana, where I work, the hazard isn't the fact that we're getting more hurricanes. It's not even the fact that we have sea level rise, because we also have relative subsidence that's been driven by oil and gas extraction, right? We have social political systems that have really disenfranchised the indigenous communities, that have taken away a lot of their adaptive capacity, including traditional practices that would have allowed them to actually still survive and thrive even in the face of shifting climate. Wanted to share this graphic with you. This is a map that was done by a few of the coastal tribes. And what they looked at is they looked at the conversion from land to water along the Louisiana coast. And in particular, they looked at the percentage of their traditional indigenous territories that had converted from land to water. And this has many implications. The most obvious one, of course, being the fact that it is much harder to maintain a residence on land when that land is no longer there. But in addition to that, the intrusion of water also means the intrusion of salinity. And so communities that are practicing subsistence lifestyles are now much less able to grow food, for example. Many of their crops aren't sustainable. They're much less able to keep cattle like they had done historically because the water is no longer really viable for them to drink. And it also impacts fisheries, right? It impacts the built environment. It really impacts everything around them. And again, it's a disproportionate burden. At the same time, we also have local policies that are increasing risk. Okay? And I bring this up because I am fairly certain that if you look across the United States, in as much as we collectively, government, private sector, nonprofits, have done community buyouts, have made an effort to help people move away from higher risk areas, we have at the same time actually put an equal or greater dollar value and number of units, right, of homes and families and infrastructure into harm's way. So it's happening at the same time, and it becomes this almost two-faced conversation, right, where you have on the one hand rural communities, indigenous communities, and being told that they need to adapt, they need to move, they need to be realistic about the risk that they face, while we're still permitting subdivision developments immediately next door. In some cases, if you look, for example, at where community buyouts have happened in the United States, some of those buyouts that were done with one particular set of government funding, the Community Development Block Grant Funds, actually were sold for redevelopment. And so people went through the trauma of leaving a community, of leaving their social networks. And we know from research and we know from practical experience that there are very negative impacts for people who are displaced, even when they participate in a government program that helps to defray the actual cost of the movement. And so people go through this experience with the understanding that they must do so because the lands on which they reside are no longer safe. And then those lands are turned around, developed, sold, and suddenly worth protecting. Okay? Not only is someone else able to reside there, but suddenly it begins to make sense from a cost benefit perspective to actually put in the infrastructure to protect those communities. I mentioned community buyouts, and this is one thing that I wanted to sort of use as an example. There have been a lot of buyout programs in the United States. I know that there are some in Canada as well. Community buyouts have been very effective in some situations, but what we really haven't done is actually track the outcomes of where people end up. Anecdotally, and from the handful of studies that have been done, it doesn't seem that families that go through a buyout process actually end up at a lesser level of risk. They end up elsewhere. Sometimes that place that they move to is no longer in the floodplain, although the data that we have does seem to indicate that many people remain in the floodplain. They may go from being a homeowner to being a renter, and they may very likely end up further away from the social capital that they had, from their networks, from their jobs. And this is even more so the case when you see buyouts in more rural and isolated areas where there simply isn't as much comparable housing stock that's affordable, that's available within the community or even in areas adjacent. A similar situation is seen when you look internationally at some resettlement efforts, whether it's driven by development, driven by disaster risk. There are a lot of very negative outcomes that are associated with that kind of displacement. Another thing that I wanted to sort of point to with community buyouts is that even though we sometimes talk about them in this context of a larger community, a county, an area, they're individual property transactions, right? It is an individual or a family entering into a transaction to sell their land, right, with an agreement not to reside there. And as such, it's very difficult for this mechanism to actually serve the needs of a community-driven relocation or resettlement. And when you look at some of these small indigenous communities, for example, that are starting to think about having to move, one of the things that they would very much like to do is to be empowered to do so collectively, right? To begin with, a collective model of action is much more in line with their life ways, with cultural patterns. It's also much more likely to lead to better outcomes in terms of health and really just across the board. And the clock is ticking because every time we have a storm, Hurricane Ida, for example, more people are displaced. Right? And so two things happen. You have this sort of slow displacement of people at a time when they are under a great deal of stress and not able to really make these decisions in the way that's best going to serve their family. And then you also have a community left behind that continues to shrink, continues to be comprised primarily of those who are most vulnerable. And so these community resettlement processes, which really seem to hold the most hope for a successful resettlement, become harder and harder over time, especially if they're limited just to the people that are there. I wanted to share a little bit of one example, a resettlement effort that's been in the news, and that is the resettlement of Ile de Jean Charles. The band of Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw. They are an indigenous tribe that's located in coastal Louisiana in Terrebonne Parish. And if you look at the picture, you can see actually Island Road. So the access to the tribe is along one road that is surrounded by water, and land has been disappearing until now. About 98% of their lands are underwater. And at the time that they were planning this resettlement project around 5-6 years ago, there were 30 families that were left on the island, and a pattern of displacement across a tribe of about 300 people, where most of them were actually just up the road, still at a great level of risk, but not down Island Road, so at least a little bit less cut off. And the tribe worked together with a lot of its allies to try to create a plan to resettle collectively, to build a new community that would pull in not just the people that remained on the island, but families that had to leave since at least as far back as Hurricane Isaac, which was 2008, in an effort to try to not only protect the persons that remained on the island, but actually revitalize the tribe, right? There were a lot of components to the plan that reestablished and reinvigorated traditional practices, ways of living more sustainably with the earth, for example, traditional seeds, bringing in buffalo to restore some of the Cajun prairie, a really neat and innovative and 100% community-driven project. And unfortunately, it has not been successful. And that brings me to another point that I sort of wanted to make today, which is the need to really interrogate what it is that we mean by success. And every time I participate in one of these conversations around relocation or community resettlement, there are a few examples that get brought up of communities that have been successfully relocated in the United States. And generally speaking, none of them is really an unqualified success. For example, one of the communities that gets brought up very often, Kinston, and only about 20%, I think, of the people who initially resided in the community remain. And although the public narrative is one of success, it was a success in terms of these transactions, that it was success in terms of property transactions that sold land and then guaranteed that it would be left empty in perpetuity. But in terms of the longer term outcomes for the people who were there, in terms of whether or not the same people benefit, I don't believe that we actually have in the US a single real or true success story, which makes that success narrative a little bit dangerous. And in this field, we like to talk about our successes. We like to share best practices. We don't often talk about all of our failures along the way. We don't talk about how difficult it is. We don't talk about how traumatic it is, honestly, for some of these communities, and even for some of us that are on the side of advising, right, to see as many of these efforts fail as do. And then I think we'd be better served by talking a little bit more honestly about just how difficult this is, and for many reasons. Because otherwise, the narrative that other professionals are hearing and the narratives that other communities are hearing is that we know how to do this and we do it well. And the logical conclusion of that thought process is to believe that then if a particular community is not succeeding at it, that it's a personal failing, right? It's not a problem with the system. It's not a challenge with the ways in which these buyouts are structured. It's actually a failure of local leadership, local initiative, which is not, in fact, the case. I wanted to show you this picture. This is Island Road. This is the one access down to Ile de Jean Charles. And this is Island Road at high tide. It's not even a storm event. And the road is accessible by truck. School buses can't go down, fire trucks have trouble, ambulances can't go down. So a lot of people had to leave as a result of that. After 2008, after Isaac, the government, both our state and federal, told the tribe that they would never repair the road, that it was too expensive and it really wasn't worth the cost benefit calculation. That was really a driving force in the decision to resettle. The tribe had been talking about it since the 90s. They understood that this was a possibility, but at that point in time, knowing that the road wouldn't be repaired, and also knowing that the routing of a levee system that was being constructed, referred to as Morganza to the Gulf, was going to exclude their community, was the other factor that left them with really no alternative other than to think of resettlement, right? And so Island Road, again, was this big part of this decision-making process. And after the tribe had agreed to resettle, had worked with the state on their grant that was in the news, the state actually did repair the road in order to put in a few $1 million worth of fishing piers for recreational fishers. And so those kinds of things are also really telling, because one of the things that the tribe was adamant about was that if they were going to lose their ancestral lands where ancestors are buried and there's histories of traditional cultural practices, that they could lose that to nature, but they didn't wish to lose it to recreational fishers and other interests. And so at this point, the resettlement has run into a lot of challenges, and it's talked about as being a success, but I don't believe a single family is in a home yet. There's been a lot that's been written about it. And one of the biggest challenges actually was that when it came down to trying to implement a really innovative plan and process that had been designed and put together by local tribal leaders, when it came time to try to do that through regulations and bureaucratic systems, it actually wasn't possible, right? So that's another cautionary tale as well, as when we think about community-driven efforts, when we think about trying to work with rural and Indigenous communities, from the perspective of government, we need to be very careful that we're not promising the impossible. So just to kind of get to wrapping up, what would it mean to really have success in this space? I personally believe that it means really ensuring that efforts are community-led, that they truly are voluntary, and that what we're measuring in terms of outcomes is along a longer term horizon than simply the movement from one location to another. And also that it be family specific, right? Not this sort of aggregate of we took X number of units out of a floodplain, but that we really think about what the individual outcomes were for each family in terms of whether or not their risk was reduced in the longer term. Because if what we're doing is moving people simply to be at risk from another event, with less resources than they had to begin with and less social capital, then we're not really reducing risk, we're hiding it. We're simply sweeping it under the rug and leaving it for someone else to deal with later. Thank you.
Thank you, Alessandra. That was fantastic. There's so many things I wrote down, and resettling collectively. I mean, I talk to the folks. Who are the folks? You got to talk to the folks. They've got lots of good ideas too, and fair play and respect. There's so many things that came into my head. And that one road is like it was in reality, but it was also a metaphor. We are all vulnerable. We all have that one road, and if it gets swamped, it's anyway. That was fantastic. I thank you, and I look forward to the conversation afterwards. But thank you for all of that. That's cautionary. I'd also like the idea of looking at failure as a learning experience, as a tool. So thanks for that. It gives me great pleasure now to introduce our second guest, Dr. Lily Yumagulova. Lily is a resilience scholar and risk management professional, and she lives in the village of Slocan in British Columbia. Lily is a Bashkir woman with degrees in engineering, risk analysis, and a PhD in resilience planning. With over 20 years of work experience with government, NGOs, media, indigenous communities, and supernatural national organizations in Europe and North America, Lily is the program director for the Preparing Our Home program that empowers Indigenous youth leadership in community resilience. She is currently a Banting postdoctoral fellow at the Indigenous Learning Department at the University of Saskatchewan. Her research focuses on Indigenous self-determination and the role of women in disaster risk reduction, climate displacement, and planned relocation. I turn things over to you, Lily, and look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Peter, thank you so much for that generous introduction. And Alessandra, thank you so much for your presentation. Really honored to be presenting with you today. And thank you everyone for joining us today. This is a very important topic and often a very uncomfortable one. And I'm glad to see people like Graham Watt on the call today as well, people that have gone through some of the very, very tough learnings. And many of us will have to go through this at some point, probably in our professional career. So I'm really grateful for the BCAAM for starting this conversation now. So I'm joining you, as Peter said, from the beautiful Sinaiaks lands. The Sinaiaks were declared extinct under the Indian Act, but Elder Marilyn James is still here, still teaching us, and with the hope that we can be better stewards to this land. All right, so I first wanted to open today with some of the international frameworks that are guiding this work. And why is that important? Climate change is a global issue, but the outcomes are locally acute. And to deal with these kind of global issues, we also have a bunch of global frameworks that are helping us. Most of you, I imagine, on the call are really familiar with the Sendai framework, but there are all kinds of other frameworks that address sustainable development goals, that address climate mitigation goals, so on and so forth. There are frameworks around Indigenous rights that on DRIP and DRIPI in BC that followed. In BC, we have things like Abbott and Chapman report, EPA reform, interim recovery framework. There is a lot happening at the policy level. Sometimes it's really hard to keep up with all of it. Then there are also additional things that we're kind of increasingly being asked to consider, which is really good. Things like gender-based analysis and how do we apply that to disaster recovery process or disaster mitigation, so on and so forth. These are very important things to keep in touch with, right? So kind of like constantly curious and evolving, how can we improve our field? I think that's what I really love about emergency management is that dynamism. We can always do better. So one of my mentors, Margareta Wallström, so the woman behind the Sendai framework, she led the Sendai framework development, which was launched in 2015, and we're coming on to 15 years in 2030, right? So we have 8 years to make the very urgent progress if we are to stick to kind of two objectives. When I asked her, what did she see as some of the barriers to the way we're doing disaster risk reduction at the time, that was in early days. And what she really said is short-term thinking, that we have succumbed through neoliberalism, capitalism, and all other isms to this notion of really short-term thinking. So the idea of not having long-term plans is deeply counterintuitive to planning and building for resilience. There was something else she said at the time, which really stayed with me for all these years, and it was the following quote. If you look at what the IPCC says, it's interesting, there's an obsession with the 2 degrees. It takes away from the fact that 2 degrees is an average globally, and that in some parts of the world, the increase will be 9 degrees. It will become uninhabitable. Some things that we know is that Canada and northern latitudes are warming twice the rate of the global average, and the north is 3 times. We had extreme events just a few days away in the Arctic, temperatures that none of the scientists could have ever predicted. So that's something we need to keep in mind, that our scientific models have a lot of limitations. So there gotta be a lot more to the planning processes that we're initiating. And local Indigenous knowledges are really important for that. So what are some of the challenges of planned relocation? And this list can be endless, like really, really long. So I just picked a few. Similar to what Alessandra said, it's really important to move at the speed of trust. And moving at the speed of trust in the kind of disaster recovery space is very difficult. It's highly political. There is the bulldozer of disaster recovery machinery. There is people. A lot is happening there. It requires this kind of strategic relocation planning really requires long time frames. So some of the communities that relocated, they started 10 years ago, and it's still unclear if it's successful, right? So how do we initiate that process from the beginning? Our current government funding models are unfit for this process, right? Like, what kind of funding do we have in Canada right now? It's pretty ad hoc, it's competitive, it's short term, it depends on shifting political agendas. There is a lot that people and communities are working with. There was a national report in Canada that looked at relocation commissioned through NRCan, and what they found is basically that the majority of relocation really happens after the disaster. It's reactive, a lot can go wrong. Communities, and as in Grand Forks, and how quickly Grand Forks moved on that, it was a remarkable story. Similar in High River, like we have examples where it happened, but communities are faced with many trade-offs and costs. You know, what are you selling your house on? Ideally, you're selling it for the price that it was worth the day before the flood, right? Like, not that what it's worth after it's flooded, and so on and so forth. So there is a lot of that to discuss. The cost of displacement, though, the financial cost, is but one variable. As Alexander said, there are lots of social, emotional, deep-seated costs that are not accounted for properly. And then the really big question is, of course, how do we not repeat the same mistakes? Indeed, who pays for the burden? Is it the system of convenience? We remove certain people and we put certain other uses. So that kind of equity consideration is really, really important. How are women impacted through the relocation process? Mothers, right? Who pays within the communities? Who pays the burden? The other really important thing to consider when we talk about planned relocation is how we engage. So this is just from Facilitating Power and Movement Strategy Center. I like this graphic because it visually shows us the forms of engagement, right? So we can ignore your voice, needs, and interests not matter. We're just going to do what we think we need to do. We can inform. We will keep you informed. We will consult. We care what you think. We will involve. You are making us think and therefore act differently about the issue. So really focusing on the voice. We can collaborate. And I think it will be very, very important in the spaces of planned relocation to really, truly collaborate and initiate the deeply uncomfortable conversations around land rights, inherent rights. So what does that look like? Your leadership and expertise are critical to how we address the issues, whose voices will be heard, whose leadership will be listened to. And then community ownership. It's time to unlock collective power and capacity for transformative solutions, right? So if we look at this kind of spectrum from kind of, we're telling you what to do, to the kind of objective of justice, there is a lot of steps to walk in how we engage with communities. So some are joining today from the Lower Mainland. So this is a photo that Chris Hadfield took of the Lower Mainland back when he was in space. It's a remarkable delta, really, quite developed. You can see it's a spring freshet time, right? It's flushing out the silt. So when I first came to Canada, I'm a newcomer to Canada. Well, I've been here for a while now, but when I first came and I started looking for my PhD at UBC, what to focus on, there was this map that I came across, which it's an older map now, but it shows Fraser Frechette master plan. And as I was looking at this map, something really kind of struck me. If we look at the dikes, if we look at the floodplains, the gray areas, we can see that the kind of municipal assets are protected by the dikes, but none of First Nations lands are. They're in the floodplains as well, but they're not protected by the dikes. It really kind of, for me as a newcomer, initiated thinking, why is that? What choices were made not to protect First Nation communities while municipalities were protected? And a lot of it came down to cost-benefit analysis that Alexander talked about. Certain lands that were not seen as worth protecting, right? Because they didn't have the same kind of economic value. So then I went and talked to 60 people across the province: engineers, planners, emergency managers, former premiers, Mike Harcourt, Mr. Campbell. And I asked them these questions like, where are we going with this? You know, like with climate change planning, like where are we moving? And I found that different professions at the time were really grappling with different issues. So for engineers, it was really the science. Engineering is based on the principle of stationarity. So the way things acted, for example, water hydrological stationarity in the past, we can plan based on that for the future. Well, that's changed. We can't do that with climate change anymore. And as one of the senior engineers said, it's almost fundamental. You've changed the direction you're looking at. It's a change of how we thought about planning for 40 years. For engineering, right? For planners, it was really uncomfortable conversations. Which land are we going to protect? Where should we retreat? How much is everything going to cost? For emergency management, something that you're probably grappling with, it's reconciling that kind of short-term planning that we're so used to with long-term scenarios. So we need to look at retreat. This isn't going to stop. It's more than likely to get worse and more extreme. And we have to be able to identify where vulnerabilities are. This was at the time a senior person with the NBC. For politicians, it was really investing today and seeing the benefits 10, 15, 30 years down the road when you're not in political office anymore. So how do you combine hydrological and political cycles? After that, I went and did a lot of work with Indigenous communities across Canada because I saw this gap, the deep inequity gap, and created Preparing Our Home program really to understand, so where are things at in Indigenous communities? And some of the things, as you know, Canada is warming at twice faster than much of the world. Colonial dispossession of land, waters, and not just land, waters as well, very important. Culture and community resilience, right? Like we're sitting on this, on the legacy of the Indian Act, where people were forcibly taken from their land, forced into small reserves, denied adaptive strategies like the winter villages and so on and so forth. So there is a lot to unpack there. And in all of this context, there are systemic inequities with housing, health, transportation, access, all of which are magnified in disasters. What is emergency is also defined very differently across communities. So in BC, for them, some communities, it's really the language loss. It's the loss of sound. So how do we define emergency? It really is really important. Who holds that power to define what is an emergency? And then, of course, many communities are really living through multiple emergencies: overdose crisis, flooding, a residential school trauma, a wildfire, heat dome, right? Like, so it's just kind of never ending. So planning for future is a real luxury, not affordable for many. In terms of where to live and where to stay, the phrase that I heard the most often, we are here to stay. So that's something that we need to work with, right? And then that's kind of some of the broader statistics. So as a First Nation individual living on reserve, you're 33 times more likely to be evacuated due to wildfires, 18 times more likely due to any floods, 10 times the residential fire mortality is 10 times higher, and so on and so forth. The list really goes on of really deep-seated inequities. In BC, this is exciting time because we're looking at UNDRIP and DRIPA. And I know for many practitioners, it's really confusing, and which articles do we focus on? How do we unpack it? So I recommend to begin with, and this is something that I've heard from First Nation leaders, look at Article 19 and 29. So free, prior, and informed consent. What does that look like in disaster mitigation, in disaster recovery? And Article 29, so conservation and protection, self-determination, and where implemented assistance programs for Indigenous peoples, for such as conservation, protection, disaster mitigation, recovery, are implemented without discrimination. So how can we do that, to begin with at least? Another thing that I would really recommend practitioners is to look around for Indigenous-led frameworks for adaptation and disaster recovery. They exist, they're out there. Communities are doing exceptional work. And at the core, what's different is the Indigenous values that are guiding this work. So for example, the medicine wheel, the beautiful framework that was developed for sea level rise planning out east, please look them up. There is exceptional, amazing work happening. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of case studies as we wrap up. So this is work that was led by Darlene Yellow Old Woman Monroe for the National Coordinating Centers of Public Health. It looked at the Bow River flood. So thousands of people were evacuated, which is a lot. They were displaced for 6.5, some of them were displaced for 6.5 years following the flood. The evacuation process was highly traumatic. So these are some of the quotes. I just felt like I'm in prison here. My children are not safe. Their rooms are down the hallway. Therefore, we must constantly ensure they're safe. So people were living in these ATCO trailers, something that's happening in BC right now for communities that are displaced. And it felt like it's a residential school all over again. Regimental environment, you're grabbed from your home, you're put into cots and so on and so forth. So trauma and isolation were significant. Transportation, getting around was very difficult for people that were going through displacement. Increased substance use, addiction, domestic violence, and there were multiple phases of displacement throughout the 6 years. So people moved over and over and over again. And as part of the process, there was relocation. Some communities were relocated. But unfortunately, as Alexander highlighted, if you remove the flood risk, you're removing but one risk. So clan structures were disrupted. The community was placed by the road. Road incidents, fatalities increased, kind of the social issues and so on and so forth came out that weren't there before. So they were, flood was but one risk that was reduced, but many other things really didn't work and became less safe. So that's something to keep in mind. And another exciting work that's happening in communities right now is around planned relocation is really Indigenous value mapping. So really looking at how and what is important for communities. In BC, Tsleil-Waututh have done it, the Haida have done it. So this Lillooet Nation is the nation that I'll speak about a little bit, and Matagami First Nation in Ontario. So really looking at the traditional values of the land, how it's used, mapping the hydrological impacts of colonization, all of those things, really exciting research and work that's happening by communities. And we need to do as much as we can to support this work, especially youth being involved in this work. So I just wanted to finish here with an example from Lillooet, a community that we worked with a lot through preparing our home. And so here is the home of the eagles, the Atloa village site. As you can see, it's the eagle head here. So this is a planned community. The original community was here, which was faced with many, and there is still community there, but this was a planned community where they purposefully moved. The school was built, residential area, core services were moved on the slope away from the flood. So it was developed in the 80s in response to flooding concerns and because the community was growing, right? So, and it was at that time the INAC or Aboriginal Affairs and engineering companies guided this process. So how do we ensure that these processes are community-led and that the voices are heard and that the urgent needs that the communities have are heard? So those are some of the things to consider. And also just to remember that this is not as new as we think. We've had some lessons, we can learn from them, especially ideally not to repeat the mistakes that we've made. So I want to thank you for your attention today. I have a short video from the Lillooet youth to show if we have time. I'm totally open not to show it if we don't have time. So it's really, if Peter can let me know if we have 2 minutes or not.
Yeah, I think we should hear from the youth. I think it's great. And thank you very much for that really wonderful presentation, Lily. So Alexa, could we just get the
and I think it's very important to hear this video because I just want to leave you with direct voices of Indigenous communities and also the things that matter to them. So what was done in this video, it was part of the hazard mapping. So what are all the different hazards that can happen in Lillooet? And flood is but one of them. So thank you, Alexa, for putting that on.
Yeah, just give me a minute. Thank you.
Yes, and I see that there were some comments in the chat as well. Thank you so much for that. Looking forward to discussing that.
It's interesting, the convergence, Lily, between what you and Alessandra said, learning from our mistakes, consulting community. These things are essential for moving forward, local knowledge as well. So yeah, look forward to a quick Q&A at the end after we see this video, but lots of great commentary there. Here we go.
Fire, flood, massive earthquake, mudslide, rock slide, terrorist attack, alien abduction, no Wi-Fi, zombie attack, power outage, train derailment, car crash, rains, lava, World War III, and no food. Nuclear plant, diseases, protest, yeah. Bombs, murder, assassin, tornado, flash flood, tsunami, and spies. Avlanda? Avalanche, Philly, yeah. Poison gas, angry dogs, bridge out, yeah. Blizzards, meteor shower, evil clowns, and rabies.
Rock slide, house fire, forest fire, landslide, flood, power outage, volcano, electrical, propane leak, communicable disease, water shortage, internet, icy road, snow day, earthquake, heat wave, air quality, road closures, train derailment, angry dogs, terrorism, accidents, vehicle, collapsed bridge or building, acid rain, tsunami.
Wow, incredible. Hearing those voices, know all of those single words about disaster. Thank you for sharing that, Lily. There's a question if that video is available. Could others view it afterwards? Oh, there, I think it looks like it's popped in the chat there. So there's an answer to that question. We have about 10 minutes left. So I want to open the floor up to our guests, and maybe I'll start with something that Cheryl asked, which is I think it's a good question, and there actually, I think there's a few ways that you can answer it. She asks about, she can't imagine being relocated for safety reasons and then finding out others were using the land. Has there been any redress or reparation around that? And I think in a way, just to expand that question a little bit, but thanks very much for it, Cheryl. What are the attitudes in and around what you two are talking about? Has there been a change in attitudes? I listen to you speak and I think, well, clearly there's not enough listening going on. There's appetite on one side, it seems. Is there appetite from government, from other agencies, from emergency? And I'll just throw that out to, you can either, both can answer that.
So I'll go ahead and answer first. So in terms of that particular project, it is still underway, and there hasn't really been any redress. The tribe is seeking other ways to be able to facilitate its resettlement. You know, in the United States, whether or not the sovereignty of a tribal nation is recognized hinges in part on a formal recognition process, which is by and large impossible for small tribal nations to really successfully navigate, and tribes that are not formally federally recognized don't really have a legal status in the United States outside of that which they can take on through incorporation into, for example, a nonprofit. And so that really does limit the avenues of redress. At the same time, the folks that live on Ile de Jean Charles have been hit by several storms and several floods in this time period that they've been working on the resettlement. And so that also makes it a lot more difficult to really be able to stand up in the face of some of these government processes that prove to be really unjust. Now, there's a great chapter, it's open source, it's available. It was written by my colleague, Nathan Jesse, who along with myself and others supported the writing of that grant for the resettlement initially. It's in a book that was published by Springer, the editor Shirley Laska. I can put information in the chat if you want to sort of learn more about the history of that process, especially from a planning perspective and an inclusion perspective. It's a really interesting chapter. The other thing that I would say is I think community members across the board are becoming more aware of this risk. We've seen a lot more news pieces come out. I'm really highlighting what's been happening with buyouts. So after Hurricane Sandy, for example, along the New York, New Jersey coast, there were some people who explicitly refused to even consider a buyout unless they could be given express assurances that that land would be left to be open space and that it wouldn't be allowed to gentrify and be developed into larger properties. Some community members, some communities are successful in making those kinds of arguments, others are not. But I think there is growing awareness. There's also a growing discussion around equity more broadly. But it's interesting to note that some of the ways in which our federal agencies in the US are defining equity are really much more of a definition focused on equality, which is certainly not the same. So I feel that the conversation has shifted. I don't think that the implementation of programs has shifted yet. So depending on whether you catch me on a good or a bad day, I either am optimistic that we're going to start to do a little better because this conversation is happening, or I'm actually really quite terrified that because the conversation is happening, because the language is out there and the buzzwords are out there, and we have a new executive order, that's going to sort of excuse more business as usual, just with a few of the key terms thrown in.
Thank you, Sandra. From the Canadian side, Lily, do you sense that there's been a change in attitude, in acceptance of what you both have been presenting today?
Well, I first want to thank Don, who brought up the real tragedy that's happening right now. So communities living in ATCO trailers along the Trans Mountain Pipeline, communities considering being relocated. I think in Canada, there's been significant semantic evolution. Yes, I think we're using different words. It has not fully translated into action yet. And it is hard because at the core of this issue is land. So what are the land processes that are in place? So for example, one of the processes, addition to reserve process, ATR, these are long processes. Some communities, it's taken them 35 years. Is this a land mechanism that can be accelerated given the conditions of climate change, given that literally land is sweeping away from some people's under their feet? So there are a number of issues. And the other really important thing, though, as we reframe the narrative, as we use new words, some of them are good, some of them could be really bad, like nature-based solutions. We could use it again to do the same mistake what conservation has done, separating indigenous peoples from their lands, which is a wrong thing to do. For many, like biodiversity outcomes, people's well-being, land protection, like for many, many different reasons, right? So as we move into space, reframing the narrative, we also need to move away, though, from constantly focusing on deficit-based approaches, that these are vulnerable, marginalized communities. There is a lot of strength. I would also completely caution using the word resilient because it does have that kind of neoliberal positive ring to it, but describe people where they are at as close as they can to their situation using their words, right? So I think that's really important, and focus on indigenous capacities. So what are the things that are working? When we talk about gender-based analysis, we often think about women as vulnerable. Well, in some of these communities, they are truly the leaders. These are women that are leading these processes through matriarchal traditional systems and so on and so forth. So the language that we use to describe people, that's something that we can do better for sure because of the framework changes. But there are hopeful spaces, but there is a lot of work. And I think for associations to host this critical kind of conversations is very important. For practitioners, just to be really open, to become uncomfortable, to have some of your inner truths a little bit violated, you know, like you're just letting go of whatever you're bringing. And then Indigenous practitioners, people like Cheryl, we really need a lot more representation within. So whatever your organizations can do to hire people and pay them for training, you know, we can't, there are many educational barriers. Not everybody will have GIBC certificate or whatever. If they're doing the work, we need to design systems that will support them in doing their work instead of constantly chasing credentials that these people simply don't have time to get, right? So, sorry, that's a long rant, and I don't know if it's fully answered the question, but just some things to consider.
No, it's awesome, and we're running out of time. Sadly, I honestly think we could spend a workshop just on this topic. We could spend days, weeks, years, as you two are obviously immersed in it. This is being recorded, which is fantastic. So I'm really going to encourage folks to visit the site. I'll give you the coordinates again just in a second. But before I do that, I want to thank you both for your presentations today, for your passion. There's lots of love in the chat for both of you and for what you had to say. It's tricky. It is difficult. I loved what you had to say about learning from failure. I think we too often shy away from that. You talk about uncomfortableness. Let's just get into it. If you're uncomfortable, that's okay. Think about the situation. It's pretty uncomfortable. So I really want to thank you from just really, it was just an awesome, and I don't know, there's lots to unpack in what you had to say. So thank you both. This is the last session in season 2, as I mentioned. You can access the recordings at the BC Association of Emergency website. And any questions or suggestions you have, please send them along to communitydisasterrecovery, all one word, @gmail.com. Large thanks to both our guests today and to all the terrific guests who have shared their wisdom and their questions and their understanding in our second season of presentations. I'd also like to shout out again to Alexka for her wonderful IT skills throughout all of the episodes. And a large shout out to the grand Deb Borzos, who put this all together and is a producer extraordinaire. Thanks to all of you, folks who are making a difference in your community and in many other communities too. We'll be sending out a short survey to get your thoughts on what happened this time around and what you'd like to see going forward. If you have topic suggestions on community recovery, people we should contact with regard to potential guests, it's all part of the survey, and we appreciate you taking the time to fill it out and send it back our way. And as this is the last episode, on behalf of our sponsors and supporters, the entire recovery team, my home turf, the Canadian Centre for Rural Creativity, we wish you all well. And until next time, take care of your good selves, treat others the way you'd like to be treated, and continue your great work in sharing and caring and working to leave the campsite better than you found it. Thank you all. It is now 4 o'clock, and with best wishes to everyone, we'll see you next time.